So how I see this working out is we've got about 20 questions, 25 questions in the list here. And there's a number of questions for everybody, so I'm going to do my best to sort of synthesize them into things that can be appropriate for everyone. Modern medicine seems to have fear of death in its underlying motif. What do you all think about what underlies the healing that may be taken up through alchemy as a counter to that death fear?
Well, fear of death has been around quite a while. One of the promises of alchemy has always been superior medicines, extension of life, and has always been a major goal.
Yes.
I think it's all part and parcel of the whole philosophy behind alchemy. It's figuring out what actually constitutes life and how to maintain it.
Right.
I would also say that the fear of death is because we don't have a truly spiritual consciousness. We don't live with the union of this life that we have and the larger soul that we have. So that is a big part of our work, hospice work, which is helping people to see that death is not the end. And many people do seek our remedies for health and longevity, which is a good thing. But the truth of the matter is, in all healing work, if we're honest, we also have to educate any person that we're working with that we are mortal in the sense that this physical sheath has a limited time. And I think also the fear of death is that if we don't have a life purpose, if we're not really engaged in our life, then we have a fear of death because we haven't really lived. So that would be my answer.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe even to Warren's point about the dead body is just the chemical components, and it's the life element that has really been disconnected from contemporary science. If we just are a physical chemical body and there's not something beyond that, the loss of that physical chemical thing is terrifying.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful question. Yeah, there's a question here for you, Robert. Is there a loss of volatiles when using dry samples for your practice?
No, according to Holland, you want them to be so powdered and dry that you can just crush them between your fingers and they'll turn to dust. It's amazing that they go in for distillation and they're bone dry like that. It's amazing how much water actually does come out. And this is all water that's chemically combined with the materials. So it's not like residual moisture, it's actually chemically combined water inherent in the molecules.
Yeah, that makes sense. And an additional question in there is, what is the action of synergists?
The action of a synergist.
Yeah.
A synergist will aid a certain process or material, enhance its qualities. For example, turmeric is enhanced by a small amount of black pepper. Small addition of black pepper to turmeric will increase its bioavailability by about 1,000. So there are many synergistic combinations like that. One plant aiding another to give out its true nature more powerfully than it can do alone.
Okay. Let's see. Patricia, with the iris flower essence, in using it, is it a question of applying it to your eyelids if you have dry eyes, or is it more beneficial to ingest it?
Good question. We do a lot of topical applications. You can make a compress using the iris and impregnate the iris into another kind of base. For instance, castor oil is really good in general for the eyes. That was advocated by Edgar Casey. But so that's one way. We actually do have a couple of medical doctors, one in particular in Costa Rica, who presented on this very topic when she came here for a seminar, and she does injections, but she is in another country, and she does it in a way where she's very safely working. So it's nothing that I recommend, but I have to tell you, we have casework, and she gets really amazing cases that are across the spectrum, from the emotional and soul consciousness shifts, as well as healing the eyes. And she helps the client see literally how these come together. But we can also take the iris flower essence, like all of them, as a solution. And that's typically how they're done in dosage bottles as solutions. And that's particularly helpful when the general indication is there. And so the general indication for iris is not necessarily that we're even aware that our eyes are the problem, they might be, but more that we don't see with our soul. And so that's really where a general remedy in a fluid base taken over time, in intervals of time, because that's an important part of dosing, will be very curative, because we begin to, as it were, hydrate with iris. We begin to have the moisture in our soul. So
Yeah.
many different answers to that question. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of at the heart of this next question too, which is somebody was asking Robert about whether using the advanced tools like this they're a little bit of an abstraction. And the question is, do you feel like that disconnects us from the instrument that Goethe talks about, the human organism developing these capacities to build relationships with it? Is there a disconnect, or is it an opportunity just to get another perspective?
I think all these instruments are really extensions of our senses. We have the ability to detect and feel many things that maybe we won't admit, but all of these various instruments really are extensions of what we can see and hear. I mean, we live in a world that we don't see or hear. For example, ultrasound. There's a whole world outside of ultrasound. You go around with a device that will translate ultrasound into audio frequencies that we can hear, and you'll be amazed at what's going on out in the world everywhere. Insects flapping their wings so fast, or putting out ultrasound. You walk into a room full of computers or TVs, and it's screaming, literally screaming with ultrasound. Same with light we don't see, all sorts of things that our senses can't handle. So these instruments are really allowing us to extend our range of view, our sensory input, to a world that's already there. This just helps us to become aware of what's out there.
Right. Yeah, because I know, a lot of the work that I've done with Dennis is about developing the imaginal capacity. I think that's kind of what Patricia's speaking to a little bit, where the organ of perception that's developed within the human being to see subtleties that a machine couldn't, a tool couldn't. And so the combination of those, to me, really seems what the future of alchemy can be. We can't forget that inner development, the refinement of those capacities to have the insight to say, you know what, I could use this tool to look at the humors to your presentation without that subtlety of inner perception to say, what can I put this tool to use on? That's, I think, where the real potential comes. Yeah. Great point, that sometimes it's manifesting the invisible that allows us to build a relationship to it in the first place. Yeah. Let's see.
Look at the rise in ghost hunting technology.
Right?
There's a lot of instruments out there that are so sensitive that there are people who can pick those things up naturally, but a lot of people can't. And there are instruments now that aid us in crossing that bridge and detecting things that you can't see or detect in any other way unless you're very psychic.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that I think is sort of where this helps understand that people are able to understand and cross these bridges that we've seen alchemically. A lot of the stuff that Rudolf Steiner talked about at the beginning of the 1900s, now science is saying, yep, 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 yep. But we didn't have the technology to be able to see it then, but perhaps the extension of his perception allowed for those technologies to even be developed in the first place because they had something to reach for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. So there's an interesting question in terms of the alchemical process. When the sulfur process happens, the ash falls out. Is there a process that happens where the ash falls out and then that ash becomes active again? How is it that the process, what happens in between that state where the ash then becomes enlivened again?
Well, the ashes do modify the sulfur when it comes back in contact with it. We have plants that there are acids, organic acids, for example, and a lot of the plant extractives and the salts being alkaline, they create salts, new salts within the plant extract, and that becomes a way they become re-enlivened in the organic connection.
Huh.
So
Yeah.
the salts.
Another thing is within Federal Barristers First Order Elixir, it's not necessarily the ash that gets recharged, but upon reacting the salts with the tincture, you could then take those salts after they've been reacted and reburn them. And that kind of almost recharges the minerals. So you can use them again and add them back to more tincture and react them and go to a second order elixir and so forth. But you could reburn the minerals, but it's kind of not directly answering that question, but I think it's still relevant that through the process of reburning the minerals after reaction, you can recharge them, repurify them in a way that can then react with the tincture more and, drive more, reactions, but also create something that's, higher vibration.
Yeah. There's also, a lot of the metallic works, the salts, the metals actually act as catalysts to alter the solvent. And they actually take place in a reaction that strings together the menstruum into new compounds, new polymers. And the metals themselves actually fall out in the end. We end up with a very complex oil that was catalyzed by the addition of the metal salts.
Yeah, I could imagine too, there's an element of the life process then, depending on what we're using that salt for, or the ash for, what does that then, what allows that to be active again, say, if you're using it, in my dad's case, as in a plant spray, the reactivation of it coming into contact with the life of the plant. There's a kind of cycling back around.
Yeah. I think it was George Starkey who said that anything that reaches down into the balsam of life must be of a saline nature, because a sulfur taken by itself will be destructively digested and changed. Right. And the salt will be neutralized by the stomach acids. But if the two are combined, they form something totally new that penetrates deeply into the body, into the tissues.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah, and a sort of part of this question references something you said, Dad, is you spoke about the two parts of the sulfur process. And they say, I only have cooking uniting as one process in their notes. What's the other process there? Sorry, the question's jumping around. Yeah, so in the sulfur process, you'd said that there were two parts to it. maybe even 3. Is that, can you say more?
Yeah, that's the salt is the thing that draws the life to begin with into the plant, but then it becomes congealed in the plant. And when I take it apart, like spaghetically, I have to purify the salt. It's called dealbation. I just keep purifying the salt until it becomes open again to receive the volatiles. That's why I asked a question from Robert about the volatiles, because every time I put a plant in the still, I smell it. That's a volatile, but it's not part of the distillation anymore. So that's why I asked that question, what portion is that volatile of the total analysis of the way the oils are operating in the plant. So in a salt and sulfur, there's the 2 parts. The one is the bringing together of the separate parts through the warmth. And then if that becomes extreme, then the warmth separates off and the ash falls down. But then the ash has to be purified again and again, as Warren just said, through repeated purifications or dealbation until it becomes open again to receive the oil. That's called whitening the salt alchemically.
I always
Yeah.
say in the lab that if you can smell it, you're losing it.
Well, I know, but that's what I'm saying. So what happens when I dry it? Aren't I losing it? I put them in the dryer at the lowest temperature and I can smell them throughout the lab.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's always some losses. They're the most volatile materials.
That was my question about drying, because I found that if I really want to get really good oil, when I harvest the plant, if I shock it and leave it overnight with a cover, the plant naturally is having a response to being shocked, and it will enhance the oil content from the plant when I put it in the still. And I put it at the lowest temperature possible. And once it starts rolling, I use a Clevenger to separate the oil. And it stops, the fragrance stops once it starts to actually work into the Clevenger. Then I'm not losing it.
I was concerned about that as well. And I did the same process. Instead of drying the plants, I put them absolutely fresh. I mean, picked right off the vine, right into the flask, and no drying. And then later determine the moisture content of a separate sample of the plant that way. And got significant differences out of that.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure. Yeah. I'll often use something like tangerine skin in the bottom of the still because it has a way of drawing out more oil out of something like helichrysum or melissa that is difficult. And it doesn't really, that's why I asked you about synergy and synergist.
I was just going to say that's a synergistic effect.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot in that synergistic effect in terms of the medicinal properties of essential oils.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I love the conversation. This is exactly what I was hoping. Wonderful.
I really enjoyed your presentation, Robert. I have a lot of screen grabs I took off of your charts. They're pretty good.
Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful.
I kind of have a question for both Dennis and Robert when it comes to the whitening of the salts. But that process of reburning the salts and reacting it again, I did that with hemp because there's tons of oils in hemp. And eventually I got this salt that, usually you put the salt in the oven and within a few days it is dried out. But when I got really far down, I think I did it probably like 5 times reacted, maybe 6 times reacted. And I put the reacted salts in my incinerator, and it literally like looked like it exploded, like it was shooting out this crazy fireball. And then the rocks that I got were kind of like these peacock ore looking rocks. And if you blew on them, the color would go away, which I thought was interesting, that peacock color. But then when I took those black charcoal like rocks and ground them up, and I extracted the salt again with distilled water, I put that in the oven, and it took like 2 weeks to dehydrate, and the crystal structure was totally different, and it smelled like sulfur in the lab the whole time that they were drying out. And I thought that I must have made potassium sulfate or something, because it didn't look like normal plant salts anymore. And I'm just wondering what you guys think of like that, or like what happens to the salts as it keeps going down that process of reburning and then fusing back to the sulfur.
Do you use water for dissolving the salt? Do you use water for doing that?
Yeah, use distilled water.
I try to use the hydrosol.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually that starts to pull things out, and then eventually that salt will start to whiten. But what I found is if I let the herb itself go to vinegar instead of just pulling it off, that the vinegar tends to pull the oil out of the dregs. And then when you whiten the salt, you don't have such a difficult problem of the oil staying connected into the salt. If you let the ferment go all the way through alcohol and then go to vinegar, then your salt comes out whiter right at the very beginning. It doesn't take much time for dilution.
You get quite a bit more salt too.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, that's right.
A couple of things are happening also when you're saturating your salts with the tincture, calcining it. You're ending up with 2 different salts. One they call the salt of salt, which is what you get when you calcine the plant. And the other is the salt of sulfur, which if you were to take your plant extract and evaporate that down until it gets into this thick, gooey, honey-like consistency, you calcine that, and you'll end up with salt of sulfur, which is very different from the salt of salt. So as you're going through this process of saturating your salt of salt with your tincture and then calcining it, you're slowly infusing your salt of salt with the salt of sulfur. You're ending up with these 2 salts, and they start to become very much more hygroscopic. They'll absorb moisture right out of the air. Sometimes you'll put them in the oven and you pull them out, and they're already getting slimy and wet. They're absorbing moisture out of the air so quickly. They also tend to become volatile after a certain point, so you can actually start losing them when you're calcining them beyond generally around 6 or 7 times. They start to get very volatile. You can start to lose them through sublimation. So a lot of interesting processes going on with plant salts.
Yeah, while we're on the topic of lab work, there's a question about making flower essences at scale. Is there a particular process that you use, Patricia, that allows you to make them at scale as opposed to, what someone could do at home?
So what do you mean by scale? You mean an industrial approach?
Yeah, well, we've got home lab people, and then there's people looking like, okay, what could we do if we were wanting to make more of something?
Okay. I'm going to actually take that question to also answer a deeper one first. And that is that alchemy is not just about the substance. It's about the psyche. It's about the person doing the work. And that is why in the real alchemical traditions, you also went through a training with your soul to be able to do the work. And this also, I think that also does also apply to that question of instrumentation. It's not just the instrument, it's the person that's using the instrument. People get different results because of their own soul interacting with the substance, with the instrument. So that's that. I want to say that as a prelude to then saying that we can make anything, but the question is, are we present with it? And so to make the flower essences, you absolutely, you can waltz out your door tomorrow and throw a flower in a bowl, because that's what it looks like physically. And hopefully the sun is shining, but that's not what flower essences, how they're made. They're almost, in a way, a kind of sacramental process. They don't belong to any church, but we have to, first of all, live into that flower. We have to have lived long enough with the flower, walked with it, as Paracelsus would say, the book of nature, that we know when it's really in alignment with its astral sheath, which is not in this world. And then we have to somehow live into the moment when the sun, the air, the environment that the plant lives on, and we also are, how Dr. Bach made him is he used the indigenous water, because we want, there's this term in winemaking, terroir. The place where something is made is part of what makes it. So there are wines, for instance, in France that we may try to say, oh, no, you can't really duplicate the sense of place. And that's really true also with the flower essence. We're looking for the exact environment where that flower is the most alive to its star self, so to say, because we want, in the flower essences, what we want to do is capture that soul. So what I would say, if you love a flower and you watch that process, and you watch and you're in communion with what's happening around you with the four elements, you will find a time to make any flower essence you want. There's no hidden secret to making it. It's an open secret, as we say in alchemy. But that doesn't mean you've made the flower essence. Hopefully it does. I once went to a class where this woman was advertising that she was making flower essences in an efficient way. That's why I wondered what you meant by scale. And so what she was doing is kind of talking and visiting with people and, throwing out 5 or 6 bowls in her garden. Most of those flowers I didn't see as really appropriate to be making. And she said, so now you've made 7 flower essences. But you see that, I've seen that kind of work can be interesting, but it doesn't make the medicine we're talking about. And this is really the secret of Dr. Bach. He really lived deeply into these plants. He was really kind of a walking radiesthesic sensitive. And so that's really the art of making the flower essence, is to, in our own souls, be in touch with the plant, where it grows, when it grows, how it grows. And this is what in alchemy is called the quintessence, which is the 5th essence, which is the human being in resonance. And that anybody can do it. That's what making a plant is. We've never made the essences in large amounts. I mean, like industrially. For us, it's the fun part of the work, frankly. And we're hiking up over tree levels. We're on the ocean. We're in the forest. It's just a lot of fun, because what we're doing is we're finding these places and we're connecting with the plants. So that's what making the flower essence is. And I invite whoever asks that question, just get involved, start doing it. And it will teach you itself. If you ask those kinds of questions, it will teach you itself. So the laboratory in the case of flower essences is not necessarily in a building. It's in the temple of the heart and the heart of nature.
Oh,
I agree. There's always a bit of the alchemist in his product. You know, the observer affects the observed, and you can give 10 people a recipe for a pie, and you'll end up with 10 different pies. It depends
Exactly.
on the person making the pie, and you put more of yourself into your work than people realize, and that's been something I've noticed as the major difference between chemistry and alchemy is that you are part of the process and you affect it more than you may think.
And I might just say, just to bring it down to the real practical level, I'm an old Polak. I come from a line of Polish farmers. My first alchemical teacher was my grandmother. We lived on the prairie, so she had a wood stove, but we fed it with corn cobs. And I learned to watch her making bread. And she called the bread, the flour, matka, meaning the mother. It was the mother substance. I was her apprentice. I went out, she would only moisten the flour with fresh spring water, absolutely fresh from the earth. And we had to get up early. She would knead the bread so that the bread rose with the rising sun. And she had a prayer, and I don't know, she said it in Polish, so I don't know it, but it was beautiful. She sung it. And incantation, by the way, is a big part of alchemy, prayer and incantation. And then the bread would rise. And then one of my assignments is, again, we fed the stove. She refused to ever cook on any kind of stove but a wood burning stove, but we fed it corn cobs. And I had to put the corn cobs in at certain times to make sure the temperature was there. And her bread was, for me, more powerful than Holy Communion. I mean, we went to a church and the priest gave us a wafer. And I don't want to put that down, but when my grandmother served us her bread, it was like communion. I really felt like I was nourished on every level of being. And none of us, this is the moral of the story, were ever able to duplicate her bread. None of my sisters, no one. It was her medicine. And that was my first teacher of alchemy. So I just want to also say it's that practical. It's that the kitchen is, for many of us women, I love to cook. The kitchen is an alchemical every day. I want to keep my husband healthy. You know, I make foods that I feel that I want to be as alive as possible. And I want to also say that alchemy is that.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I like that. I'm a old Polak too, Patricia. You know that. And when I'm growing my plants for oils, I spray them every night. The spray is from other plants that I consider to be benefactors of the plants, of the organ that I'm trying to develop in the plant. And every time I go around and spray, I say a little prayer of thanks to that plant. And that is a benediction. That
Yes.
is holy water from another plant. And I think you can transfer a particular virtue from one plant to another, especially if you do it in a prayerful way. And I think I totally agree, Patricia. That is, to me, that is what is alchemy is about. It's not just about doing things, it's about doing things in a sacred manner. It's about doing things and paying attention to what is already there, and then trying to get out of the way of meddling in what is already there as a human, so that you can be a synergist through your own consciousness. I totally agree, Patricia. It's beautifully said. One Polak.
Thank you. Well spoken. I know they think of us as crazy,
Yeah,
but
yeah, dzień dobry.
I've noticed that on
Ostrovia.
occasions. If you, I mean, if you give a person a tincture and they take it is one thing, but if you impress on that tincture what you want it to do, and say an incantation or prayer to it, or give it direction, what you want it to do, it does it much more effectively. Many times I've seen this over and over. So they do listen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, beautiful. Thank you all so much. That's just a wonderful place to end, and is in exactly the right mood that we brought this event together. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, your time, your resources, your communities. And yeah, I can't say it enough. Thank you so much. We hope you enjoy the rest of the event, and yeah, blessings.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you, Ben. Thanks,
Nice to meet
everybody.
all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Joe.
everybody.
But thanks.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. We will join with you again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific. Same link. And we have a wonderful group of people going more deeply into the medicine making and healing the body and the soul. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for participating.